Hey, welcome to Horror Ecos. Before we start, just a quick note. After the first few minutes, the rest of the video plays without breaks. So get comfortable and give it a try. I think you'll enjoy these stories. If you do, you can like and subscribe. Only if you really want to. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time it is for you? I read them every night. All right, let's begin tonight's story. Stories start now. My guardian angel named Mary. There are moments in life that define us. Moments that we carry with us forever. Moments that shape who we become and how we see the world. Sometimes these moments are joyful, filled with laughter and light. Sometimes they are painful, marked by loss and heartbreak. And sometimes, if we are very lucky, these moments teach us that love and protection can transcend even death itself. This is the story of one such moment in my life. A story about a girl named Mary, who saved my life twice. Once while she was alive, and once after she had already passed away. I need to take you back to the beginning, back to when I was just a kid in 3rd grade. Life was simple then. My biggest worries were whether I would get to play outside after school, or what my mom was making for dinner. I was a happy kid, carefree and innocent in the way that only children can be. I had blonde hair that my mother kept neatly combed, blue eyes that my grandmother always said were too pretty for a boy, and a smile that came easy. I was nice to most everyone I met. My parents had raised me to be polite and respectful, to treat others the way I wanted to be treated. In 3rd grade, I had the incredible good fortune of being assigned a seat directly behind the smartest kid in our entire class. Her name was Mary, and she was something special. Mary had the most beautiful long red hair I had ever seen. Every single day, she wore her hair in carefully braided pigtails that were always perfectly done. You could tell that someone, probably her mother, spent a lot of time each morning making sure those pigtails were just right. They were intricate and neat, with little ribbons woven through them that matched whatever dress or outfit she was wearing that day. Mary was smart. I mean really truly smart. Not just the kind of smart where you get good grades because you study hard, but the kind of smart where things just made sense to you naturally. She understood math problems before the teacher even finished explaining them. She could spell words that I had never even heard of. When we had reading time, she would finish the assigned chapters in half the time it took the rest of us, and then just sit there quietly, waiting for everyone else to catch up. For some reason that I never quite understood at the time, Mary had taken a liking to me. I was a cute kid, I guess, with my fair hair and blue eyes. But I had absolutely zero interest in girls. None whatsoever. At that age, girls were just classmates to me. No different from the boys except they wore dresses and played different games at recess. I didn't understand romance, or crushes, or any of that stuff. It was all just beyond my comprehension. But even though I didn't understand why Mary liked me, I was nice to her because I was nice to everyone. And truthfully, having Mary sit in front of me turned out to be one of the best things that could have happened to me academically. You see, Mary was absent from school quite often. I never really thought much about it at the time. Kids got sick. That was just part of life. But whenever Mary came back to school after being absent, she would always position herself in just the right way during tests, so that I had a perfectly clear view of her paper. Now I need to be honest here. I was not the smartest kid in the class. Not by a long shot. I was average at best, and in some subjects I struggled. Math especially gave me trouble. I would stare at those numbers and equations and just feel completely lost. But when Mary was there, when she angled her paper just right so I could see her answers, I got 100% on every single test. Every single one. I knew what she was doing. She knew I knew. But neither of us ever talked about it. It was just this unspoken thing between us. Mary would help me, and I would be grateful and kind to her in return. It was a simple arrangement, and it worked well for both of us. Then came Valentine's Day. This was back in the 1960s, a much simpler time in many ways. The rules for Valentine's Day in our class were very straightforward. Every student had to give a Valentine card to every member of the opposite sex in the class. All the boys had to give cards to all the girls, and all the girls had to give cards to all the boys. No exceptions. It was meant to make sure nobody felt left out, to ensure that everyone got Valentines and nobody went home with an empty bag. Most of us kids just went to the drugstore with our parents and bought those cheap packs of Valentines that cost maybe 3 cents each. They had generic messages on them like "Be mine" or "You're sweet," and you would just write the person's name on them, not very neatly in most cases, and hand them out. It was quick and easy, and didn't require much thought. But when Valentine's Day came, and it was time to exchange cards, Mary gave me something completely different from what all the other boys received. While the other boys got those same generic drugstore cards, Mary handed me an elaborate, handmade card. She had clearly spent hours making it. It was made of white lace and red construction paper hearts that had been carefully cut out and arranged. The craftsmanship was incredible for a third grader. But what really made the card special was what was written inside. In Mary's careful, neat handwriting were the words, "I love you very much, Joe." I just stared at that card, not really knowing what to make of it. Love? What did that even mean? I was 8 years old. I didn't understand love, not romantic love anyway. I loved my parents and my siblings and my dog, but that was different. This was something else entirely, something I had no framework for understanding. In return, I gave Mary one of those standard 3-cent drugstore cards with her name printed inside in my sloppy handwriting. Looking back now, I feel terrible about how inadequate my card was compared to the one she had made for me. But at the time, I genuinely didn't understand that there was anything wrong with it. I thought all the cards were basically the same. The other kids in class noticed immediately. They saw Mary's elaborate handmade card and my boring store-bought one, and they started the teasing right away. Joe and Mary sitting in a tree, kissing. They sang. First comes love, then comes marriage, then comes baby in a baby carriage. It was the standard playground chant that kids used to embarrass each other about having crushes. I felt my face turn red. I was embarrassed and uncomfortable with all the attention. But Mary didn't seem bothered at all. She just smiled and ignored the teasing. She was confident in a way that I couldn't understand at that age. She knew what she felt, and she didn't care what anyone else thought about it. My parents had taught me to always be respectful and to have good manners. So even though I was embarrassed, I made sure to thank Mary properly for the wonderful card she had made for me. I told her it was beautiful and that I really appreciated all the work she had put into it. And I meant it. Even if I didn't understand the romantic feelings behind it, I could recognize that she had done something special for me. After Valentine's Day, things between Mary and me got closer. She would turn around in her seat before class started, and we would chat about all sorts of things. She would tell me about books she was reading or shows she watched on television. She would share parts of her lunch with me, giving me cookies or fruit that her mother had packed for her. We became friends, real friends, in a way that went beyond just the kid sitting behind her who occasionally copied her test answers. But Mary was still absent a lot, more and more frequently as the year went on. Sometimes she would be gone for a whole week at a time. When she came back, she would look tired and pale, but she would always smile and act like everything was normal. It never occurred to me to ask her why she was absent so much. I just accepted it as part of who Mary was. Some kids were absent a lot, just like some kids were really good at sports, and some kids were really good at art. It was just how things were. Then one day, I came home from school and found my mother waiting for me with a very serious expression on her face. She sat me down at the kitchen table and told me that she needed to talk to me about something important. My heart started beating faster. Had I done something wrong? Was I in trouble? But it wasn't about me at all. My mother explained to me that Mary had a disease called leukemia. She told me that Mary was very, very sick, and that's why she had been absent from school so much. She was in the hospital receiving treatment, and things were not going well. Mary's mother had reached out to my mother to arrange for me to visit Mary in the hospital because Mary had asked to see me. I sat there trying to process this information. Leukemia. I had never heard that word before. I didn't know what it meant. My mother tried to explain it to me in simple terms. It was a disease of the blood, she said. It made Mary very weak and sick. The doctors were trying to help her, but it was a very serious illness. I was not the brightest kid. It honestly didn't occur to me to ask the most important question. The question that was probably on my mother's mind the whole time. I didn't ask if Mary might die. Death was just outside my understanding at that point in my life. In my sheltered, innocent world, only old people died. Grandparents died. Great aunts and uncles died. But kids didn't die. That just didn't happen in my experience. So I never even considered it as a possibility. My mother gave me some instructions for the hospital visit. She told me that I absolutely must not talk to Mary about her disease. I wasn't supposed to mention leukemia, or ask her how she was feeling or anything like that. I was just supposed to be normal, and friendly, and positive. My mother also told me to make sure I said that I missed Mary, and at some point during the visit, I needed to tell Mary that I loved her. That last instruction confused me. I was supposed to tell Mary I loved her? I had never told anyone I loved them except my parents, and even then only when they said it to me first. The whole idea made me uncomfortable. But my mother was very clear about it. Mary needed to hear those words from me. It would make her happy and give her something to hold on to during this difficult time. A few days later, my mother took me to the hospital. I had never been inside a hospital before. The smell hit me first, that distinctive hospital smell of disinfectant and medicine and something else I couldn't quite identify. Everything was white and sterile and intimidating. Nurses in crisp white uniforms walked briskly through the hallways. Doctors in long white coats conferred in quiet voices. Machines beeped and hummed from behind closed doors. We found Mary's room, and my mother knocked softly before pushing the door open. Mary's mother was there, sitting in a chair beside the bed. She stood up when she saw us and came over to give my mother a hug. They spoke in low voices for a moment while I just stood there, suddenly very nervous about seeing Mary. When I finally looked over at the bed, I was shocked by what I saw. This didn't look like the Mary I knew from school. This Mary was white as a ghost, so pale that her skin seemed almost translucent. She had tubes sticking out of her arms connected to bags of clear liquid hanging from metal poles. There were all kinds of machines surrounding the bed, with wires and monitors and blinking lights. The whole scene was overwhelming and frightening. But when Mary saw me, her face lit up with a smile. Despite how sick she looked, despite all the medical equipment surrounding her, she was still Mary. Her eyes still had that same sparkle, that same intelligence and warmth that I recognized. I forced myself to smile back, and said, "Hi, Mary." My voice came out quieter than I intended, almost a whisper. Following my mother's instructions, I told Mary that everyone at school missed her. I told her that I missed her. I stumbled through the words, trying to sound natural even though everything about this situation felt unnatural and strange. And then, at one point I managed to say that I loved her. It wasn't eloquent or smooth. I probably said something awkward, like and dumb. I love you too in response to something she said. But I got the words out. Mary brightened up noticeably when I said that. Her smile got wider, and her eyes seemed to shine a little brighter. She told me she loved me very much. She said that when she got better, she wanted me to come visit her at her house. We could play games and watch TV and just hang out like normal kids. It was almost the end of the school year. Summer vacation was just a week or so away. Mary said she didn't think she would be well enough to come back to school before summer started. But maybe over the summer she would get better, and we could see each other then. Our mothers left the room at some point to give us privacy. Mary and I talked for a while longer, though I honestly didn't have much to say that I hadn't already said. So I just kept repeating the same things. I missed her. Everyone missed her. I hoped she would get better soon. I loved her. She seemed happy just to have me there, to have someone from her normal life visiting her in this strange, clinical hospital room. After about half an hour, the visit was over. I said goodbye to Mary, told her I would see her soon, and left with my mother. We drove home in silence. I went back to my little sheltered world, back to school and friends and playing outside and all the normal things that 8-year-old boys do. The hospital visit faded into the background of my mind. I thought about Mary sometimes, wondered when she would come back to school, but mostly I just went on with my life. It was one of the final days of the school year. I remember the day vividly because it was incredibly hot. This was the 1960s, and there was no air conditioning in the school. We had these little windows that only opened a few inches, a door propped open to the outside to try to get some airflow, and one solitary oscillating fan in the corner of the classroom that slowly rotated back and forth, occasionally sending a small breeze in your direction if you were lucky, enough to be in its path at the right moment. I was sitting at my desk, watching the big wall clock slowly tick away the minutes. Each second felt like an eternity in that hot, stuffy classroom. I was daydreaming about summer vacation, about swimming in the pool and riding my bike and sleeping in late. Just a few more days and we would be free. Then the classroom door opened and the principal walked in, followed by the school nurse. This was unusual. The principal rarely came to individual classrooms unless something important was happening. Everyone sat up a little straighter in their seats, curious about what was going on. The principal walked to the front of the classroom and stood next to our teacher. He had a very serious expression on his face. He cleared his throat and began to speak. He reminded us all about how Mary had been absent a lot this year. Then he explained that Mary had been absent because she had a disease called leukemia. And then he said the words that I will never forget as long as I live. Mary had died yesterday. The classroom went completely silent. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. We all just sat there, trying to process what we had just been told. Mary was dead, but she was just a kid, just like us. How could she be dead? The principal continued talking. He told us things about Mary, some of which I already knew and some of which I didn't. He said she was smart and kind. He mentioned that she had 4 older brothers. He said that her family would miss her terribly, but that she was in heaven now and was no longer sick or in pain. He said that someday her family would see her again in heaven where they would all be together forever. There was some muffled talking among the students. A few kids raised their hands to ask questions. The principal and nurse answered them as best they could, trying to help us understand and process this terrible news. But the whole conversation only lasted about 30 minutes. Then the principal and nurse left the room. As they were leaving, the classroom door didn't latch properly. It swung partway closed but didn't catch, leaving it slightly ajar. My desk was fairly close to that door, and I could hear it creaking back and forth a few inches, with a slight squeaking sound as it moved. We were all left to navigate the subject of death on our own. There were no grief counselors in the 1960s, no special assemblies or group therapy sessions. Just a 30-minute talk from the principal, and then we were expected to move on. I felt sad, of course. I felt bad that I wouldn't be able to visit Mary at her house like I had promised I would. But I didn't really understand the permanence of death. I didn't fully grasp that Mary was gone forever, that I would never see her smile or hear her voice again. At some point during that long, hot afternoon, something strange happened. A big gust of wind came out of nowhere. It was strange, because it had been a completely still day. No breeze at all, just oppressive, stagnant heat. But suddenly this strong wind blew through. The wind caught the classroom door that had been creaking slightly open. It pulled the door fully open, swinging it wide. And then, just as suddenly, the wind reversed direction. The door swung back from being fully open and slammed shut with a violent bang that made everyone in the classroom jump. The loud noise woke us all up from our grief-induced daze. The class clown, a kid who never missed an opportunity to make a joke, said loudly, "Maybe it was Mary." The teacher berated him sternly for making light of such a serious situation. Nobody laughed, but I remember thinking that maybe the class clown was right. Maybe it was Mary, making her presence known one last time. That weekend I went to Mary's funeral with my mother. It was my first funeral. I had never been to one before and didn't know what to expect. The funeral home was filled with people dressed in black, many of them crying. Mary's family was there, her mother and father and her 4 older brothers. They all looked devastated, broken by grief. Mary's casket was at the front of the room. It was open. I had not realized that displaying the dead person was a thing that people did at funerals. Nobody had prepared me for this. When I saw Mary lying there in the casket, I wanted to run out of the room. I wanted to go home and pretend this wasn't happening. But my mother's hand was firm on my shoulder, holding me in place. Mary looked like she was sleeping. She was wearing a pretty white dress, and her red hair had been carefully arranged around her shoulders. She looked peaceful, but also not quite like herself. There was something missing, some essential quality that made her Mary. The body in the casket looked like Mary, but it wasn't really her. The real Mary, the smart, kind, vibrant girl who had helped me in class and made me elaborate valentines, was gone. At some point, my mother and I went up to the casket to pay our respects. I stood there looking down at Mary and told her I was sorry. I told her I missed her. I didn't know what else to say. Mary's mother came over and kissed the top of my head. She thanked me for visiting Mary in the hospital and told me it had meant a lot to her daughter. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak without crying. That was that. Episode 1 of Death Navigated. I had learned that death was real, that it could happen to anyone, even kids. I had learned what grief felt like, that hollow ache in your chest when you lose someone you care about. And I had learned that life goes on, even when someone you love is gone. The years passed. I grew up. I went through middle school and high school. Girls who had once fawned over me in elementary school lost interest as I peaked early and became just another average-looking teenager. I got a little motorcycle when I was old enough for a learner's permit. The permit had restrictions, one of which was that I had to be off the road by midnight. My parents were very strict about this rule, and I had never given them any reason to worry. I was responsible and punctual, always home well before curfew. Then came my high school graduation. There was a big party that night at someone's house across town. I went with some friends, excited to celebrate the end of high school and the beginning of whatever came next. At the party, there was beer, which I consumed more of than I should have. And there was a girl there, someone I had just met that night. We hit it off immediately, talking and laughing and eventually making out in a corner away from the rest of the party. For the first time in my life, I was experiencing the pleasures of French kissing. It was exciting and overwhelming, and completely absorbed all my attention. I tried to take things further, but the girl wasn't interested in going beyond kissing. So we just made out for what felt like hours. I am normally a very responsible, punctual person. But that night, overwhelmed by new sensations and more than a little drunk, I completely lost track of time. At some point, I happened to glance down at my watch. It was 1 a.m. 1 a.m. I was supposed to have been home by midnight. My stomach dropped. I was in so much trouble. I thought about my oldest brother, who had come home just 10 minutes late from a party once. His punishment had been severe and loud. My father had yelled at him for what seemed like hours, had taken away his stereo, and had even kicked him down the stairs as a finale. And he had only been 10 minutes late. I was an hour late. There were no cell phones back then. No way to call and explain or apologize. I just had to get home as fast as possible and face whatever punishment was waiting for me. I hopped on my motorcycle, even though I had been drinking all night. This was incredibly stupid and dangerous, but I wasn't thinking clearly. Rather than take the main roads where police might be patrolling, I decided to take the winding back roads. I figured cops wouldn't be out there at this time of night. I wasn't even worried about driving drunk. I was only worried about being caught out past my learner's permit curfew. I sped through the night, taking curves faster than I should have. I knew these roads well. I had ridden them many times before. Up ahead, I knew there was a hairpin curve, a really sharp turn that had a posted speed limit of 20 miles per hour. But I had taken that curve at 35 or 40 miles per hour many times before, and had always been fine. I wasn't worried about it. As I approached the curve, I saw something that made me slow down. Just before the curve, right by the edge of the road, there was a woman standing there. She was wearing a long white dress that seemed to be made of some sheer, flowing material. She was illuminated somehow, glowing in the darkness. It all happened so fast that I couldn't process what I was seeing. What was a woman doing out here in this remote spot at 1 a.m? I slowed way down, my alcohol and hormone-addled brain trying to make sense of this vision. Part of me was confused. Part of me was aroused, my mind still caught up in what had been happening at the party. Part of me was just curious about who this woman was and what she was doing there. Suddenly, a small dog darted out into the road right in front of me. I reacted instinctively, putting my foot out to avoid hitting it. My foot caught the dog, not hard, but enough to send it yipping and running off into the darkness. I came to a complete stop. I looked back at the woman in white. She had long red hair that flowed down her back. As I looked at her face, recognition hit me like a physical blow. I knew those eyes. I knew that face. It was Mary. It was the girl from 3rd grade who had died all those years ago. She was standing there by the side of the road, looking at me with those same intelligent, warm eyes I remembered. Mary smiled at me. Then she turned and walked into the thick woods beside the road. Within seconds, she had disappeared from sight, as if she had never been there at all. I sat there on my motorcycle, my heart pounding, my mind racing. Had I really just seen Mary? Or was I so drunk that I was hallucinating? I turned my motorcycle around and positioned it so that the headlight shone into the woods where Mary had disappeared. I searched the trees and shadows, looking for any sign of her. There was nothing. Just dark woods and silence. Then, the realization hit me. If Mary hadn't been there, if I hadn't slowed down to look at her, that dog would have run out in front of me while I was going 40 miles per hour around a hairpin curve. I would have swerved or crashed. On a remote back road at 1 in the morning, with no one around to help me. I probably would have died that night. Mary had saved my life. She had appeared to me, had slowed me down, had protected me from a terrible accident. She was my guardian angel, watching over me even after all these years, even though she had died when we were just children. I got back on my motorcycle and drove home slowly, carefully, my mind still reeling from what had just happened. When I arrived home, I found that my parents had fallen asleep. They never knew I had come home late. They never found out about the party or the drinking or the girl, or how close I had come to dying on that dark road. But I knew, and I would never forget. Mary had saved me twice in my life. Once when we were in 3rd grade and she helped me pass my tests and taught me about kindness and friendship. And once on a dark road years later when she appeared to me in a long white dress and slowed me down just enough to avoid a fatal accident. I am an old man now. Mary has been gone for most of my life. But I still think about her often. I still remember her red pigtails and her elaborate valentine, and the way she would turn around in her seat to chat with me before class. I remember visiting her in the hospital and seeing how sick she was. I remember her funeral and the terrible grief of losing someone so young and full of potential. And I remember that night on the back road when she came to me one more time. When she saved my life even though her own had been cut short. I don't know how it happened. I don't know if it was really her ghost or spirit or if it was something else entirely. But I know what I saw. And I know that if she hadn't been there, I wouldn't be here now. Mary is and always will be my guardian angel. And I am grateful every single day for the time I got to know her. Both in life and in that one brief moment after death. She taught me about love and loss, and the possibility that something of us continues on even after our bodies give out. She gave me the greatest gift anyone can give, the gift of life itself. I hope that wherever Mary is now, she knows how much she meant to me. I hope she knows that I never forgot her, that I carried her memory with me through all the years of my life. And I hope that when my time finally comes, and I leave this world behind, Mary will be there waiting for me, smiling that same smile I remember from 3rd grade, ready to guide me to whatever comes next. Because if there really are guardian angels watching over us, protecting us from harm, then I know without a doubt that mine has long red hair, and a kind smile, and a generous heart that couldn't be stopped, not even by death itself. Thank you, Mary, for everything. Next one story start now. The woman who walked through walls. Some people go their entire lives without ever seeing something they cannot explain. They live in a world where everything makes sense, where the laws of physics are never broken, where the boundary between the living and the dead remains firmly in place. I am not one of those people. My first encounter with the impossible happened when I was barely old enough to form complete sentences. I was only 3 or 4 years old, still sleeping in a small bed in a room I shared with my infant brother. And on one particular night, I saw something that would shape the rest of my life, and open my eyes to a reality that most people never experience. I need to set the scene for you so you can understand exactly what happened that night. We lived in a small apartment on the 2nd floor of an older building. It wasn't anything fancy, just a modest place that my parents could afford on my father's salary. The apartment had 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, a living room, and one bathroom. My parents slept in the master bedroom, which was right next door to my room. The two bedrooms shared a wall, so thin that I could sometimes hear my parents talking or moving around late at night when I was supposed to be sleeping. My bedroom was small, but cozy. I had a twin bed pushed against one wall, and right next to my bed was my baby brother's crib. He was still an infant at the time, maybe 6 or 7 months old. He was a good baby, quiet and peaceful. He rarely cried at night, which my mother was always grateful for since she was exhausted from taking care of 2 young children. The room had one large window that looked out over the street below. During the day, that window let in beautiful natural light that made the whole room feel bright and cheerful. But at night, the window became a problem. Our apartment was on the 2nd floor, but we were positioned in such a way that we could see a major intersection on top of a hill in the distance. Cars would come over that hill throughout the night, and their headlights would shine directly into my bedroom window, creating these bright sweeping beams of light that would move across my walls and ceiling. To solve this problem, my mother had hung thick, heavy drapes over the window. These weren't the thin, decorative curtains you might see in a modern home. These were serious drapes, the kind designed to block out light completely. They were made of heavy fabric with a floral pattern on them, roses and leaves in shades of pink and green. When those drapes were closed, my room became very dark, almost pitch black except for the small amount of light that might seep in from under the door. I remember those drapes vividly. I remember the weight of them, how they felt when I would run my small hands over the fabric. I remember the floral pattern and how I would trace the shapes of the roses with my finger during the day. I remember how they smelled, that particular musty smell that heavy old curtains get. These details are burned into my memory because of what happened that night. It was late, probably well past midnight. The apartment was completely silent. My father was asleep in the master bedroom. My mother was asleep beside him. My baby brother was sound asleep in his crib, breathing softly in that peaceful way that babies do. And I had been asleep too, curled up under my blankets in my small bed. But something woke me up. I don't know what it was. There was no noise, no disturbance that I could identify. But I suddenly found myself wide awake, my eyes open, staring up at the dark ceiling above my bed. And I felt something, a feeling of anxiety or unease that I couldn't explain. Looking back now as an adult, I would describe it as a sense of wrongness, a feeling that something in my environment was not as it should be. At 3 or 4 years old, I didn't have the vocabulary or the conceptual framework to understand what I was feeling. I just knew that something felt off. Something felt different. And I had this overwhelming urge to examine my room, to look around and make sure everything was okay. I sat up in my bed slowly. The room was dark, but my eyes had adjusted quickly. When you're a child and you wake up in the middle of the night, your eyes seem to adapt to darkness much faster than they do as an adult. I could see the outline of my brother's crib next to my bed. I could see the darker shadow of the closed drapes covering the window. I could make out the shape of my dresser against the far wall. Everything looked normal. There was no reason for the anxiety I was feeling. The apartment was silent and peaceful. I wasn't in any danger, but still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. And then it happened. Suddenly, like something out of a movie, a glowing figure emerged from the wall. The wall that separated my bedroom from my parents' bedroom. One moment the wall was solid and normal, and the next moment something was coming through it, passing through the solid matter as if it wasn't even there. The figure glowed with its own light. It wasn't reflecting light from somewhere else. It was producing light, emanating it from its form in a soft, pale glow that lit up the surrounding area. The light was gentle, but bright enough that I could suddenly see details of my room that had been hidden in darkness just moments before. I could see the floral pattern on the heavy curtains clearly now, lit up by the glow from this impossible figure. I could see the individual roses and leaves on the fabric, could see the way the light made shadows dance across the folds of the material. That detail has stayed with me all these years because it was so strange and beautiful and terrifying all at the same time. The figure itself was several feet off the floor, hovering or floating in the air. It didn't have feet that touched the ground. It simply existed in space, suspended by nothing. And even though I was just a small child, I recognized immediately that this was not normal. This was not something that should be possible. I was struck with a mobilizing fright. Have you ever been so scared that you literally cannot move? That's what happened to me. Every muscle in my body locked up. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run to my parents' room. I wanted to pull the blankets over my head and make this thing go away. But I couldn't do any of those things. I was frozen, paralyzed by fear. Unable to do anything except stare at this glowing apparition that had just come through my wall. I remember my heart pounding so hard that I could hear it in my ears. I remember the feeling of my throat being tight, like I couldn't breathe properly. I remember the cold fear that washed over my entire body, making me feel like I had been dunked in ice water. The figure appeared to be feminine. Even at 3 or 4 years old, I could somehow sense that this was a woman, or at least something that presented as female. The shape was definitely feminine, with what looked like a dress or some kind of flowing garment. And that garment moved in the strangest way. It flowed and flared as the figure moved around my room, but not in the way that fabric normally moves. It was more like how a dress would look if someone was wearing it underwater. The movement was slow and fluid and dreamlike. The fabric billowed and rippled even though there was no wind, no air current to cause such movement. It defied physics and gravity, and all the normal rules that govern how things move in our world. I wish I could remember more details about the figure itself. I wish I could tell you what the face looked like, or what color the dress was, or any other specific features. But I can't. That part is frustratingly vague in my memory, even though everything else about that night is crystal clear. I remember the floral curtains and the glow and the movement of the garment, but the actual appearance of the figure is hazy and indistinct. Maybe that's because I was too young to process what I was seeing. Maybe my brain couldn't handle the details and simply didn't record them. Or maybe the figure itself was somehow unclear, not fully formed in the way that physical objects are. I don't know. All I know is that when I try to picture the apparition now, all these years later, I can only recall the general impression of a feminine figure in a flowing white dress, glowing with an otherworldly light. The figure moved around my room. It floated from the wall where it had emerged, drifting slowly through the space. It moved past the foot of my bed. It moved past my brother's crib. My brother, somehow, remained fast asleep through all of this. He didn't stir, or wake up, or react in any way. It was as if the apparition was invisible to him, or as if he was too young and innocent to sense the wrongness of what was happening. I watched the figure complete its journey around my room. It moved in a slow, deliberate path, as if it was searching for something or examining the space. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. One moment it was there, glowing and impossible and terrifying. The next moment it was simply gone. It didn't fade out gradually or disappear through the wall. It just ceased to exist, as if someone had flipped a switch and turned it off. The moment the figure vanished, I could move again. Whatever force had been holding me frozen in fear was suddenly released. And I let out the most tremendous cry that had probably ever come from my small body. It was a scream of pure terror and panic, The kind of scream that only children can produce when they're truly frightened. I screamed and screamed, unable to stop, unable to form words or communicate what had happened. I just screamed at the top of my lungs, my whole body shaking with fear and adrenaline. Within seconds, I heard footsteps running toward my room. The door burst open, and my mother rushed in, her face full of concern and worry. She came straight to my bed and gathered me up in her arms, holding me tight against her chest. I was crying hysterically, still screaming between sobs, completely inconsolable. My mother held me and rocked me, making soft shushing sounds and telling me that everything was okay, that I was safe, that nothing could hurt me. My father appeared in the doorway, asking what was wrong. My mother told him I had probably just had a nightmare. My baby brother miraculously remained asleep through all the commotion. I wanted to tell my mother what I had seen. I wanted to explain about the glowing figure and how it had come through the wall and floated around my room. But I was too young. I didn't have the vocabulary or the language skills to describe what had happened. I could barely form complete sentences at that age, let alone explain something as complex and impossible as what I had just witnessed. So I just cried and clung to my mother, taking comfort in her presence and her warmth. Eventually, my crying subsided into hiccups and sniffles. My mother stayed with me until I calmed down completely. She lay down next to me in my small bed, her arm around me, until I finally drifted back to sleep from sheer exhaustion. The next morning I had vague memories of the night before, but I was too young to really process what had happened. Children that age exist very much in the present moment. Yesterday's fears fade quickly in the bright light of a new day. I probably mentioned something about being scared or seeing something in my room, but I doubt I could articulate it in any meaningful way. My mother, as always, was attentive and loving. She checked on me frequently that day, asking if I was okay, making sure I felt safe. But she didn't push me to talk about what had frightened me. She just let me be a child, playing with my toys and going about my normal routine. Years passed. Many years. I grew from a small child into a teenager and then into an adult. I had other experiences throughout my childhood and adolescence that I couldn't quite explain. Times when I felt presences that shouldn't be there. Moments when I saw things out of the corner of my eye that vanished when I looked directly at them. Dreams that felt more like visions, showing me things that would later come true. But I always questioned these experiences. I would tell myself that I was imagining things, that my mind was playing tricks on me, that there had to be a logical explanation for everything I was experiencing. I didn't want to be the weird kid who believed in ghosts and psychic phenomena. I wanted to be normal. So I pushed these experiences to the back of my mind and tried not to think about them too much. My mother, throughout all these years, had always been somewhat mysterious about certain things. She would sometimes know things that she shouldn't be able to know. She would make predictions that would come true. She would sense when something bad was about to happen to someone in our family or among our friends. She would sometimes look at me with this knowing expression, as if she could see right through me and understand things about me that I didn't even understand about myself. I knew my mother was different somehow. I knew she had abilities or sensitivities that most people didn't have, but we never really talked about it explicitly. It was just this unspoken understanding that existed between us. My mother knew things. She sensed things. And that was just how she was. Then, when I was in my 20s, my mother and I were having one of those deep, meaningful conversations that sometimes happen between parents and adult children. We were talking about life and experiences and the nature of reality. And somehow, the conversation turned to the paranormal and whether such things really existed. I mentioned, somewhat hesitantly, That I had always felt like maybe I was sensitive to things that other people couldn't see or sense. I told her about some of the experiences I'd had over the years, half expecting her to laugh, or tell me I was being silly. But she didn't laugh. Instead, she got this serious, contemplative look on her face. She was quiet for a moment, as if she was deciding whether or not to tell me something important. And then she spoke. She told me that she had known since I was 3 years old that I possessed a gift. She said she had always known that I could see and sense things that existed beyond normal perception. And then she told me why she knew this. My mother explained that on the night when I had woken up screaming as a small child, something had happened in her bedroom right before I cried out. She had been lying in bed, not quite asleep yet, when she saw an apparition appear in her room. A glowing feminine figure in a flowing dress, floating several feet above the floor. The figure had appeared near her bed, had moved around the room in that strange underwater way, and then had vanished right through the wall that separated her bedroom from mine. The moment the figure disappeared through the wall, my mother had heard me scream. And she had known, with absolute certainty, that I had seen the same thing she had just seen, that the apparition had passed from her room into mine, and that I had witnessed it, just as she had. She said she had rushed to my room, not just because I was crying, but because she wanted to confirm what she already suspected. And when she saw the terror on my face, the genuine fear and shock of a child who has seen something impossible, she knew beyond any doubt that I had the same abilities she had. That I could see the things that existed in the spaces between the normal world and whatever lay beyond. My mother explained that she had never told me this before because she wanted me to have a normal childhood. She didn't want me growing up feeling like I was different or strange. She wanted me to discover my own abilities in my own time, without the pressure of knowing that it was expected of me or that it ran in the family. But now that I was an adult, now that I was questioning my own experiences and wondering about their validity, she felt it was time to tell me the truth, to let me know that what I had been experiencing throughout my life was real. That the things I had seen and sensed were not just my imagination or hallucinations or the product of an overactive mind. They were genuine encounters with something beyond normal reality. Hearing this from my mother was both validating and overwhelming. On one hand, it was a relief to have confirmation that I wasn't crazy, that my experiences were real and shared by someone I trusted completely. My mother wasn't the type to make things up or exaggerate. If she said she saw something, then she saw it. And if she said I had seen it too, then that must be true. On the other hand, this confirmation meant accepting that I lived in a world where the impossible was possible, where the dead could walk among the living, where the boundaries of reality were not as firm and fixed as I had always been taught to believe. It meant acknowledging that I had abilities or sensitivities that set me apart from most people. And that was a difficult thing to accept. But as my mother and I talked more that day, I found myself feeling grateful for this conversation. Grateful that she had finally shared this experience with me. Grateful to know that I wasn't alone in what I could see and sense. Grateful to understand that my strange experiences throughout my life had meaning and validity. My mother told me more about her own experiences with the paranormal. She described encounters she had had throughout her life, things she had seen and felt and known that couldn't be explained by normal means. Some of her stories were frightening, encounters with presences that felt malevolent or threatening. Others were beautiful and comforting, like the time she saw my grandmother's spirit shortly after she died, looking peaceful and happy, and free from the pain that had plagued her in her final years. She explained that our family seemed to have this sensitivity running through it, particularly on her side. Her own mother had been clairvoyant, able to predict events before they happened and sense things about people that she had no normal way of knowing. Her grandmother had been the same. It was something that passed down through the generations, particularly among the women in the family. My mother said that these abilities weren't always active or consistent. Sometimes you might go months or even years without experiencing anything unusual. And then, suddenly, something would happen that would remind you that you could see beyond the normal veil of reality. It was unpredictable and couldn't be controlled or summoned at will. It simply happened when it happened. She also warned me that not all encounters with the paranormal were benign. Some entities or presences were neutral, just existing in their own reality, and occasionally becoming visible to those who had the sensitivity to see them. But others were darker, feeding off fear or negativity, sometimes even trying to influence or harm those who could perceive them. My mother taught me how to protect myself. She explained that I should never engage with entities that felt dark or threatening. If I encountered something that made me feel uneasy or afraid, I should imagine a white light surrounding me, protecting me like a shield. I should firmly tell the entity that it was not welcome, and that it needed to leave. And I should never, under any circumstances, invite communication with something I didn't understand or couldn't identify. These were lessons I took to heart. In the years since that conversation with my mother, I have had numerous other experiences with the paranormal. Some have been frightening, encounters with shadow figures or presences that filled me with dread. Others have been oddly comforting, like the time I felt my grandfather's presence in my apartment shortly after he died, as if he had come to say goodbye one last time. I've learned to trust my instincts when it comes to these encounters. If something feels wrong or dangerous, I protect myself and remove myself from the situation. If something feels neutral or even positive, I acknowledge it and then move on with my life. I don't seek out these experiences, but I no longer deny them when they happen. I've also learned that I'm not alone. There are many people in the world who have similar sensitivities and experiences. Some of them talk about it openly, while others keep it private out of fear of being judged or ridiculed. I fall somewhere in the middle. I don't broadcast my experiences to everyone I meet, but I'm willing to share them with people I trust, particularly if I think it might help them understand their own experiences. Looking back now at that night when I was 3 or 4 years old, I can see it as the beginning of my journey into understanding a reality that most people never encounter. That glowing feminine figure that passed through the wall wasn't just a random haunting or a one-time occurrence. It was an initiation of sorts, an awakening of abilities that had been dormant within me since birth. I don't know who or what that figure was. Was it the spirit of someone who had died in our apartment building? Was it an entity that existed in some other dimension that occasionally intersected with our own? Was it an echo or recording of some past event, playing out again and again for those who had the eyes to see it? I don't have answers to these questions, and I've learned to be okay with that uncertainty. What I do know is that the experience was real. Both my mother and I saw the same thing on the same night. We independently witnessed an impossible event that defied all normal explanations. And that shared experience created a bond between us, an understanding that we both existed in a world that was stranger and more complex than most people realized. My mother is elderly now, but she still has her abilities. She still knows things before they happen. She still senses presences that others cannot detect. And we still talk about these experiences, sharing our stories and supporting each other in navigating a reality that can sometimes be overwhelming and frightening. I wonder sometimes if my own children will have these same abilities. Will they see things that cannot be explained? Will they wake up in the middle of the night, frozen in fear, watching as glowing figures move through their rooms? If that happens, I'll be ready. I'll believe them. I'll comfort them. And when they're old enough to understand, I'll tell them about their grandmother and their great-grandmother, and all the women in our family who could see beyond the veil. Because this is our legacy. This is who we are. We are the ones who see what others cannot see. We are the ones who sense what others cannot sense. We are the bridge between the world of the living and whatever lies beyond. And while that responsibility can be heavy at times, it's also a gift. It reminds us that there is more to existence than what we can touch and measure and prove. It reminds us that mystery and wonder still exist in this world, even in an age of science and reason. That night when I was 3 or 4 years old, lying in my small bed in a dark room, I learned that the world was far stranger than I could have ever imagined. I learned that walls are not as solid as they appear. I learned that the dead do not always stay dead. I learned that reality has layers and dimensions that most people never perceive. And I learned that I was one of the few who could see these hidden layers. Whether that was a blessing or a curse, I'm still not entirely sure. But it is what it is. This is my reality. This is my life. And I've learned to embrace it, even with all its strangeness and uncertainty. The woman who walked through walls that night was my first teacher. She taught me that the impossible is possible. That the boundaries we think exist are really just illusions. That there is so much more to this world than what we can see with our ordinary eyes. I don't know if I'll ever see her again. Part of me hopes I will. Part of me hopes I won't. But either way, I'll always remember her. The glowing feminine figure in the flowing dress, moving like she was underwater, illuminating the floral curtains in my childhood bedroom. She was the beginning of everything. And I'll carry that memory with me for the rest of my life. Next one story start now. The man who saved me from falling. I would not be alive today if it were not for a ghost. I know how that sounds. I know that most people would dismiss such a statement as fantasy or delusion or the confused memories of a young child. But I am telling you the absolute truth. When I was 5 years old, a man who had been dead for decades reached out and pulled me back from certain death. And I remember it as clearly as I remember anything else from my childhood. This is the story of how my great-grandfather, a man I never met in life, became my guardian angel and saved me from a fall that would have killed me. Let me start at the beginning, with the circumstances that led to that terrifying moment. When I was 5 years old, my family lived in a block of flats on the 3rd floor. For those who might not be familiar with British terminology, flats are what Americans would call apartments, and the 3rd floor in Britain is actually the 4th floor in American counting, because the British ground floor is the American 1st floor. So we were quite high up, 4 stories above the street level. Our flat was modest but comfortable. It was all my parents could afford at the time. My father worked long hours at a factory job that didn't pay particularly well, and my mother stayed home to take care of me and manage the household. We didn't have much money, but we were happy. I had toys to play with, food to eat, and parents who loved me. That was all that mattered to a 5-year-old child. The building we lived in was typical of the council housing that was common in Britain in those days. It was made of brick and concrete, built quickly and cheaply after the war to provide housing for working-class families. The flats were small and the walls were thin, but the rent was affordable and the location was convenient. My father could walk to work, and there were shops nearby where my mother could get groceries and other necessities. Our flat had a small living room, a tiny kitchen, one bedroom that my parents used, and an even smaller room that was mine. The rooms all had windows that looked out over the street below. In the days before air conditioning was common, especially in working-class housing, these windows were our only source of fresh air during the hot summer months. We would open them wide to let in whatever breeze might be blowing, trying to cool down the stuffy rooms. The windows in our flat were the old-fashioned kind that opened outward on hinges. They weren't the sliding windows that are more common today. You would unlatch them and push them open, and they would swing out into the open air. There were no screens on these windows. Nothing to prevent someone from leaning out too far or falling through if they lost their balance. Looking back now as an adult, I can see how dangerous these windows were, especially in a flat on the 3rd floor with a young child living there. But this was a different era. People didn't think as much about child safety back then. There were no child-proof locks on the windows, no safety rails, no warnings about the dangers. Parents simply told their children not to lean out the windows, and that was expected to be sufficient. The day everything happened started out completely normal. It was summer, and the weather was warm. My father had gone to work early in the morning, as he always did. My mother and I had eaten breakfast together, and then she had tidied up the flat while I played with my toys in the living room. I remember being happy that day, content in the simple way that children are when their basic needs are met and they feel safe and loved. Around mid-morning, my mother realized that she needed to go to the shop. I don't remember now what she needed to get. It might have been milk or bread or some other staple that we had run out of. Whatever it was important enough that she couldn't wait until my father came home from work to watch me while she went out. My mother faced a dilemma. She could either take me with her to the shop, which would mean getting me dressed and ready, and dealing with a 5-year-old child who would probably dawdle and make the errand take much longer than necessary. Or she could leave me at home alone for the 10 minutes or so that it would take her to quickly run to the shop and back. In today's world, leaving a 5-year-old child alone at home would be considered neglectful parenting, possibly even criminal. But in those days, it was not uncommon for parents to leave young children alone for short periods of time. People trusted that their children would be safe in their own homes for a few minutes. The world seemed like a safer place back then, or at least people believed it was. My mother made the decision to leave me at home. She told me very firmly that I was to stay inside the flat and not answer the door for anyone. She said she would only be gone for about 10 minutes, and I was to be a good boy and play quietly while she was away. She probably told me not to go near the windows, though I don't specifically remember that instruction. But knowing my mother, I'm sure she did. My mother left the flat and locked the front door behind her. In those days, the door could be locked from the outside with a key, trapping whoever was inside until someone came back to unlock it. This was meant to be a safety feature, preventing burglars from breaking in. But it also meant that I was locked inside, unable to get out even if I had wanted to. I remember standing in the living room after my mother left, listening to the sound of her footsteps going down the stairs outside our flat. I listened as the sounds faded away, and then there was silence. I was alone in the flat, truly alone for probably the first time in my young life. For a few minutes I did exactly what my mother had told me to do. I played with my toys on the living room floor. I had toy cars that I would push around, making engine noises with my mouth. I had building blocks that I would stack up into towers and then knock down. Simple toys, but they entertained me. But then, for some reason that I still cannot explain or understand, I felt drawn to the window. I don't know what made me want to go there. Maybe I wanted to see if I could spot my mother walking to the shop. Maybe I was just curious about what was happening outside on the street below. Maybe it was some kind of inexplicable impulse that 5-year-old children sometimes get. The kind that makes them do things that don't make any logical sense. Whatever the reason, I walked over to the window. The window was already open a few inches because of the warm weather, but a few inches wasn't enough for me to see out properly. So I reached up and pushed the window open wider. It swung outward easily, opening to reveal the street far below. I remember looking out and being fascinated by the view. I could see people walking on the pavement below, looking tiny from this height. I could see cars driving past. I could see the shops across the street with their colorful signs and window displays. Everything looked so interesting and different from up here. I wanted to see more. I wanted to lean out further and get a better view of everything. And that's exactly what I did. Without thinking about the danger, without considering what might happen if I lost my balance, I leaned out of the window. At first, it was fine. I could lean out a little bit and still feel secure. But I wanted to see more. So I leaned out further. And further. Until I had leaned out so far that my center of gravity shifted. Suddenly, I felt myself tipping forward. I tried to pull myself back, but I couldn't. My small arms weren't strong enough. My grip on the window frame wasn't secure enough. I was falling, slowly tipping forward, about to plunge out of the window and fall 3 stories to the pavement below. I was terrified. Even at 5 years old, I understood what was happening. I understood that I was about to fall, and that falling from this height would hurt me very badly. I might have screamed. I don't remember. All I remember is the horrible sensation of falling forward, knowing I couldn't stop it, knowing I was in terrible danger. Apparently, some neighbors saw what was happening. People on the street or in the buildings across the way must have looked up and seen a small child hanging halfway out of a 3rd-floor window, about to fall. They must have been horrified. They must have known that they had only seconds to try to save me. I learned later that these neighbors rushed into our building and ran up the stairs to our flat. They pounded on the door, trying to get in. But of course, the door was locked. My mother had locked it when she left to keep me safe inside. The very thing that was meant to protect me was now preventing anyone from getting in to save me from falling out the window. The neighbors must have been frantic. They could hear me inside. They knew I was in danger. But they couldn't get through the locked door. They didn't have time to break it down. And even if they had, they probably wouldn't have reached me in time to prevent me from falling. I was going to die. There was no way around it. I was seconds away from falling out of that window and plummeting to the ground below. A fall from that height would almost certainly have killed a small child. Even if it didn't kill me immediately, the injuries would have been catastrophic. Broken bones, internal bleeding, head trauma. I would not have survived. But then something happened that defies all logical explanation. All of a sudden, I felt hands on me. Strong hands that grabbed me firmly and pulled me backward away from the window. I was yanked back inside with surprising force. Enough to completely reverse my momentum and send me stumbling backward into the room. I fell onto the floor, landing hard on my bottom. For a moment I just sat there, stunned and confused, and still terrified. My heart was pounding. I was breathing hard. I didn't understand what had just happened. I looked around the room to see who had saved me. And that's when I saw him. There was a man standing in the room with me. He was looking down at me with an expression of concern and kindness. He appeared to be older, maybe in his 60s or 70s, with gray hair and a weathered face. He was wearing clothes that looked old-fashioned even to my young eyes, like something from an old photograph. For a moment, we just looked at each other. The man smiled at me, a warm, reassuring smile that seemed to say everything was going to be okay. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he vanished. He didn't walk away or leave through the door. He simply ceased to exist. One moment he was there, and the next moment he was gone. I sat on the floor, staring at the spot where the man had been standing, trying to understand what I had just seen. But I was only 5 years old. I didn't have the cognitive framework to process what had happened. I just knew that a man had appeared, had saved me from falling, and had then disappeared. I could hear the neighbors still pounding on the door and shouting. And then I heard another sound. My mother's voice. She had returned from the shop and found these neighbors frantically trying to get into our flat. They were telling her that her son was about to fall out of the window, that she needed to hurry, that there wasn't much time. My mother must have been terrified. She fumbled with her keys, probably shaking so hard she could barely get the key into the lock. Finally, she got the door open and burst into the flat. The neighbors rushed in behind her. They all ran to the window, expecting to find the worst. But I was sitting on the floor, perfectly safe. The window was still open, swinging slightly in the breeze. But I was several feet away from it, clearly in no danger of falling. My mother and the neighbors stood there looking confused and relieved, all at the same time. My mother rushed over to me and scooped me up in her arms. She held me so tight I could barely breathe. She was crying and asking me if I was okay. The neighbors were talking all at once, saying they had seen me hanging out the window, that I was about to fall, that they didn't know how I had gotten back inside. One of the neighbors went to the window and closed it firmly, latching it shut. They all turned to look at me, clearly expecting an explanation. How had I gotten away from the window? Had I managed to pull myself back in at the last second? But I was so small and weak. How could I have possibly generated enough strength to reverse my fall? After the neighbors left, still shaking their heads in confusion and wonder at what they had witnessed, my mother sat me down and asked me to tell her exactly what had happened. She wanted to know how I had ended up at the window, why I had leaned out so far, and most importantly, how I had gotten back inside when I was clearly about to fall. I told her the truth. I told her that I had wanted to look out the window and see what was happening on the street. I told her that I had leaned out too far and started to fall. And then I told her that a man had appeared and pulled me back inside before I could fall all the way out. My mother's face went very still when I said this. She asked me to describe the man. What did he look like? What was he wearing? What did he say to me? I described him as best as I could with my limited 5-year-old vocabulary. I told her he was an older man with gray hair. I said he was wearing funny-looking old clothes. I said he had smiled at me and then disappeared. My mother left the room for a moment and came back carrying a large photo album. This was the family photo album, filled with pictures of relatives both living and dead, photographs taken over many decades. She sat down next to me on the sofa and opened the album. She told me to look carefully at all the photographs and tell her if I saw the man who had saved me. So I looked. I turned the pages slowly, examining each photograph carefully. There were pictures of people I recognized, my parents and grandparents and various aunts and uncles. And there were pictures of people I didn't recognize, relatives who had died before I was born, or who lived far away and I had never met. And then, I saw him, on one of the pages, in a photograph that looked very old and faded. I saw the man who had pulled me back from the window. He was younger in the photograph than he had appeared to me, maybe in his 40s or 50s rather than his 60s or 70s. But it was definitely the same person. I recognized his face, his eyes, the shape of his smile. I pointed at the photograph excitedly. "That's him," I said. "That's the man who saved me." My mother looked at where I was pointing. Her face went very pale. She was quiet for a long moment, just staring at the photograph. Then she said softly, "That's your great-grandfather." "My grandfather. He died many years before you were born." I didn't understand what that meant at first. How could the man who saved me be dead? He had been right there in the room with me. I had seen him as clearly as I saw my mother sitting next to me now. He had grabbed me with strong, solid hands and pulled me to safety. He couldn't be dead. But my mother explained to me that sometimes, when we need help, people who have died can come back to protect us. She said that my great-grandfather must have been watching over me, and when he saw that I was in danger, he came to save me. She said he was my guardian angel. As a 5-year-old child, I accepted this explanation without question. I didn't know enough about the world to doubt it or analyze it critically. My mother said my great-grandfather's ghost had saved me, so that must be what happened. It was as simple as that. My mother made me promise never to go near the windows again without an adult present. She also made me promise never to tell my father what had happened. She was afraid he would be angry with her for leaving me alone, even though she had only been gone for a few minutes. So I kept the secret, and my father never knew how close he had come to losing his son that day. Over the years, as I grew older, I sometimes questioned whether the memory was real or whether I had imagined it or dreamed it. Maybe I had managed to pull myself back from the window at the last second, and my young mind had invented the story about the man to make sense of what had happened. Maybe the trauma of nearly falling had caused me to hallucinate or create a false memory. But the neighbors had seen me hanging out of the window, clearly about to fall. They had been pounding on the locked door, unable to get in to save me. And yet when they finally got into the flat, I was sitting safely on the floor several feet from the window. How had I gotten there? If I had simply pulled myself back in, I would still have been right next to the window, probably clinging to the frame. But I was across the room, as if someone had physically pulled me away and set me down elsewhere. And then there was the photograph. I had accurately identified my great-grandfather from among dozens of photographs of people I had never met or seen before. How could I have done that if I hadn't actually seen him? I was only 5 years old, too young to have been told detailed descriptions of what he looked like. And yet I picked him out immediately, and without hesitation. As an adult, I've tried to research my great-grandfather and learn more about him. My mother told me that he was a kind man who loved his family deeply. He had worked hard all his life to provide for his wife and children. He had died relatively young, in his early 60s from a heart attack. That was about 20 years before I was born. My mother said that he had always wanted to have great-grandchildren but had died before any were born. She thought that maybe he had been watching over his descendants from wherever he was, and when he saw that I was in danger, he had found a way to reach across the barrier between life and death to save me. I've also tried to find rational explanations for what happened. Maybe there was someone else in the flat that day who I don't remember. Maybe a neighbor had managed to get in somehow and pulled me back from the window, then left before my mother returned. Maybe my young mind confused the sequence of events or invented details that didn't actually happen. But none of these explanations really work. The door was locked from the outside. Nobody could have gotten in without a key, and my mother had the only key. The neighbors testified that they saw me about to fall and couldn't reach me in time. And I clearly identified my great-grandfather from a photograph, which I couldn't have done if I hadn't actually seen him. The simplest explanation, the one that fits all the facts, is that something impossible happened that day. A man who had been dead for 2 decades somehow manifested in physical form, grabbed me with solid hands, and pulled me to safety. Then he vanished, his mission accomplished, returning to wherever spirits go when they're not saving the lives of their descendants. I've had a good life since that day. I grew up, got an education, found a career, got married, had children of my own. I've experienced joy and sorrow, success and failure, all the normal ups and downs of a human life. And every single bit of it, every moment of happiness, and every lesson learned from hardship, exists only because my great-grandfather saved me from falling out of that window when I was 5 years old. I've told this story to my own children. I've shown them the same photograph that I identified all those years ago. I've explained to them that sometimes, when we need help, Those who love us can reach out from beyond death to protect us. I want them to know that they have a guardian angel watching over them, just as I have one watching over me. My children react to the story in different ways. Some believe it completely, accepting it as truth without question. Others are skeptical, thinking it's just a family legend or that I've misremembered the details. But all of them find it comforting to think that their great-great-grandfather, a man they never met, cared enough about his family to cross the boundary between life and death to save a small child who was in danger. I'm an old man now myself, not far from the age my great-grandfather was when he died. I sometimes wonder if I'll be called upon to do the same thing he did. If one of my descendants finds themselves in mortal danger, will I be able to reach out from beyond death to save them? I hope I have that opportunity. I hope I can repay the debt I owe to the man who gave me the gift of life. I've never seen my great-grandfather again since that day when I was 5. I've never had any other experiences with ghosts, or spirits, or the paranormal. That one encounter was enough for a lifetime. But I know he's still watching over me. I can feel it sometimes, especially in moments when things could have gone very wrong but somehow turned out okay. A near miss in traffic. A health scare that turned out to be nothing. Times when I feel like I've been protected by something I can't see or explain. I don't know what happens after we die. Nobody does, really. We have our beliefs, and our hopes, and our fears, but we don't know for certain. But I know that my great-grandfather found a way to come back when I needed him most. I know that love is stronger than death. I know that the bonds of family can transcend the boundary between this world and whatever lies beyond. That's enough for me. That's enough to give me comfort and hope as I face my own mortality. When my time comes and I leave this world, I hope to see my great-grandfather again. I hope to thank him properly for what he did for me all those years ago. I hope to tell him about the life I lived, the children I raised, the grandchildren I played with, all the beautiful experiences I had because he saved me from falling that day. And maybe, if there's any justice in the universe, I'll get the chance to do for one of my descendants what he did for me. To reach out from beyond death, to pull them back from danger, to give them the gift of a long and full life. That's my story. A ghost saved my life when I was 5 years old. And I've spent the rest of my life being grateful for that impossible, miraculous intervention. I don't need anyone to believe me. I know what happened. And that knowledge has shaped who I am and how I see the world. Death is not the end. Love persists. Family endures. And sometimes, when we need them most, those who have gone before us find a way to reach back and help us. That's what I believe. That's what I know. And I owe it all to the man in the photograph, my great-grandfather, who died 20 years before I was born, but who was there when I needed him most. Thank you, great-grandfather. Thank you for saving me. Thank you for giving me this life. I hope I've lived it in a way that makes you proud. Last story start. The apartment in Varna. There are some places in this world that feel wrong from the moment you step inside them. Places where the air feels heavy and oppressive. Where your instincts scream at you to leave even though you can't identify any specific danger. Most of us have learned to ignore these feelings. We tell ourselves we're being silly or paranoid. We convince ourselves that everything is fine because we can't see anything obviously wrong. But sometimes, ignoring these instincts is a terrible mistake. Sometimes, that feeling of wrongness is trying to warn us about something very real and very dangerous. I learned this lesson the hard way during 3 terrifying days in Varna, Bulgaria, in the summer of 2020. My son and I had been traveling through Eastern Europe for several weeks that summer. It was meant to be an adventure, a chance for us to bond and see parts of the world that neither of us had visited before. We had started our journey in Greece, then made our way through Turkey, and were now heading north through Bulgaria toward Romania, and eventually Hungary. We were traveling on a budget, staying in hostels and cheap rental apartments, taking buses instead of trains, eating street food instead of restaurant meals. It wasn't luxurious, but it was authentic, and we were both enjoying the experience. We had spent the previous week in Istanbul, an incredible city that had completely captivated both of us. The mosques, the bazaars, the Bosphorus, the history layered upon history. We could have stayed there for months and still not seen everything. But our schedule called for us to move on, so we reluctantly said goodbye to Istanbul and boarded an overnight bus that would take us north to Varna, a coastal city on the Bulgarian Black Sea coast. The bus ride was long and uncomfortable. Overnight buses always are. The seats don't recline enough to really sleep properly, and there's always someone snoring or a baby crying or the bus making frequent stops that jolt you awake just as you're finally drifting off. My son and I dozed fitfully through the night as the bus made its way north through the darkness. We arrived in Varna in the late evening, both of us exhausted and stiff from the long journey. The bus station was on the outskirts of the city, and we needed to make our way to the center where our rental apartment was located. We had booked the apartment online a few days earlier, choosing it primarily because of its low price and central location. The photos had looked nice enough. A small but clean apartment in an older building with what appeared to be a garden area outside. We took a local bus from the station into the city center. Varna seemed like a pleasant enough city from what we could see through the bus windows. There were wide boulevards lined with trees, parks and public squares, buildings that mixed old European architecture with more modern communist-era structures. It had the feel of a city that had been important once but had faded somewhat, now trying to reinvent itself as a tourist destination. We found the address of our rental apartment and stood outside looking up at the building. It was a small house, only 3 stories tall, tucked between larger apartment blocks on either side. The house was old, probably built sometime in the early 20th century, with stucco walls that had once been white, but were now a dingy gray. There was indeed a garden in front, though calling it a garden was generous. It was more of an overgrown yard with some bushes and a few scraggly flowers. In the corner of the yard was a small gazebo, or what had once been a gazebo. Now it was a rickety wooden structure that looked like it might collapse if you leaned against it too hard. We pushed open the iron gate, which squeaked loudly on rusty hinges, and made our way to the front door. The landlady had given us instructions on how to find the key, which was hidden in a small lockbox attached to the wall near the door. We retrieved the key and climbed the narrow staircase to the 3rd floor. The stairwell was dark and smelled musty, like old books and mildew. The walls were painted a depressing shade of green that had probably once been cheerful but now just looked dingy and tired. The wooden stairs creaked loudly under our feet, announcing our presence to anyone who might be listening. I noticed that some of the light fixtures in the stairwell were broken, their bulbs long since burned out and never replaced. We reached the 3rd floor and found our apartment door. The key turned smoothly in the lock, and we stepped inside. The apartment was small, just as the photos had shown. There was a living room with a sofa and a small television. A kitchen area that was really just a corner of the living room with a stove and refrigerator, and a bedroom with 2 single beds. There was also a bathroom, which we could see through a partially open door. My son immediately went to explore the bedroom while I looked around the living area. The apartment was furnished with old, mismatched furniture that looked like it had been collected over many years from various sources. Nothing matched, and most of it was worn and shabby. But it was clean, or at least relatively clean. The floors had been swept, and the bedding appeared to have been freshly laundered. I should have paid more attention to my first impressions of the place. Because the truth is, from the moment I stepped into that apartment, I felt uncomfortable. There was something about it that just felt wrong. The air felt heavier than it should, almost thick, making it slightly harder to breathe than normal. The temperature seemed off too, cooler than I would have expected for a summer evening, with an underlying dampness that made the coolness feel unpleasant rather than refreshing. But the thing that bothered me most was the bathroom. I went to check it out, and immediately felt a wave of unease wash over me. The bathroom was tiny, barely large enough to turn around in, but what made it particularly oppressive was the ceiling. The ceiling sloped downward at a sharp angle, following the roofline of the house. If you stood in the wrong spot, you had to duck your head to avoid hitting the slanted ceiling. The whole space felt claustrophobic and wrong, like you were in a coffin or a tomb rather than a bathroom. I backed out of the bathroom quickly, feeling relieved to be in the slightly more open space of the main room. My son came out of the bedroom and asked what I thought of the place. I almost told him the truth, that I didn't like it and thought we should find somewhere else to stay. But it was already quite late in the evening. We were both exhausted from the overnight bus journey, and we had already paid for 3 nights in this apartment. Finding another place at this hour would be difficult and expensive. So I told him it was fine. I said it would do for a few nights. We could explore Varna during the day and just use the apartment for sleeping. How bad could it be? I would soon learn the answer to that question. The first night passed without incident. We were both so tired from the journey that we fell asleep almost immediately and slept soundly until morning. We woke up feeling refreshed and ready to explore the city. We spent that first day wandering around Varna, visiting the Sea Garden, walking along the beach, exploring the archaeological museum with its impressive collection of Thracian gold. Varna was actually quite a beautiful city, with a lot to offer visitors. We ate lunch at a small restaurant that served traditional Bulgarian food. Shopkeepers were friendly, and the weather was perfect, warm but not too hot, with a pleasant breeze coming off the Black Sea. We returned to the apartment that evening feeling happy and tired. We made a simple dinner in the small kitchen, watched some television even though we couldn't understand the Bulgarian dialogue, and then decided to go to bed early so we could have another full day of sightseeing the next day. The second night was also uneventful. We slept peacefully, undisturbed by anything unusual. When we woke up on our second morning in Varna, I was beginning to feel foolish about my initial unease with the apartment. It was just an old apartment in an old building. There was nothing wrong with it. My discomfort had been nothing more than travel fatigue and an overactive imagination. We spent our second day visiting the Varna Cathedral and the Roman baths, exploring more of the city's historic center, and having dinner at a seafood restaurant near the harbor. It was another wonderful day. Varna was winning us over with its charm and history. That evening, we returned to the apartment in good spirits. Tomorrow would be our last day in Varna before we moved on to our next destination. We decided to make the most of it and had already planned an early start to visit the Aladza Monastery, a medieval cave monastery located just outside the city. We got ready for bed around 10 in the evening. I settled into my bed in the bedroom while my son got into his bed across the room. We talked for a few minutes about what we had seen that day and what we were looking forward to seeing tomorrow. Then we wished each other good night, and I reached over to turn off the lamp on the small table between our beds. The room went dark. For a moment, everything was peaceful and quiet. I closed my eyes and started to drift off to sleep. Then the chandelier turned on. I opened my eyes and looked up at the ceiling. The chandelier, which I had definitely turned off, was now on, casting a dim yellowish light across the room. That's strange, I thought. Maybe there was a short in the wiring. Old buildings often have electrical problems. I was just about to get up and turn it off again when it went off by itself. The room was plunged back into darkness. Okay, definitely an electrical problem. I made a mental note to mention it to the landlady in the morning. But then, a few seconds later, the chandelier turned on again. And then off. And then on. And then off. It continued this pattern, clicking on and off, in a steady rhythm that seemed almost deliberate. My son sat up in his bed. "Dad, what's going on with the light?" "I don't know," I said. "There must be something wrong with the wiring." But even as I said this, I felt that old unease creeping back. This didn't feel like a simple electrical problem. The rhythm was too regular, too purposeful. It felt like someone or something was deliberately flicking the light switch on and off. Then we heard a new sound. A scratching noise, coming from one of the walls of the bedroom. It sounded like something with claws or fingernails was scratching at the wall from the other side. The sound was rhythmic, like the light, scratch, 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 pause, scratch, 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 pause. My son looked at me with wide eyes. "What is that?" "Probably just mice or rats in the walls," I said, trying to keep my voice calm even though my heart was starting to race. Old buildings always have rodents. But I didn't believe my own explanation. The scratching was too loud, too deliberate. And it seemed to be moving, traveling along the wall from one point to another, as if whatever was making the sound was walking along the other side of the wall. The chandelier continued its on and off pattern. The scratching continued its rhythmic assault on the wall. And then a new sound joined the symphony of strangeness. The bedroom door, which we had left slightly ajar, began to creak. It swung slowly open, then slowly closed, then slowly open again, as if moved by a gentle breeze. But there was no breeze. The windows were closed. The air in the room was still and heavy. "Dad, I'm scared," my son said, his voice trembling. "It's okay," I said, though I was scared too. "There's a rational explanation for all of this. We'll figure it out." But things were about to get much worse. The curtain hanging over the bedroom window suddenly began to swing back and forth. It moved violently, as if someone was standing behind it and pushing it. The heavy fabric billowed out into the room, and then was sucked back against the window, over and over again with increasing force. My son and I both stared at the moving curtain, paralyzed by fear and confusion. What was happening? What could possibly cause a curtain to move like that in a closed room, with no air current? And then, with a terrible crash that made us both jump and cry out, the curtain rod detached from the wall and fell to the floor. The heavy metal rod hit the wooden floor with a bang that echoed through the apartment like a gunshot. The curtain fell with it. A heavy pool of fabric lying in a heap beneath the window. For a moment, everything went still. The chandelier stopped flickering and stayed off. The scratching stopped. The door stopped creaking. It was as if whatever force had been at work had expended itself in causing the curtain to fall. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. "I'll go pick that up," I said to my son, trying to sound braver than I felt. I got out of bed and walked across the room to where the curtain and rod lay on the floor. I bent down to pick up the rod, which was indeed heavy, made of solid metal. As I was bending down, I heard my son gasp behind me. I turned around to see what had alarmed him, and what I saw made my blood run cold. My mattress, the mattress I had just been lying on, was moving. It was rolling over by itself, flipping from lying flat on the bed to rolling completely over, and then sliding off the bed frame onto the floor with a heavy thump. I stood there frozen, the curtain rod still in my hands, watching my mattress lying on the floor. This was impossible. Mattresses don't just roll over and fall off beds by themselves. There had to be an explanation. Maybe there was an earthquake? But I hadn't felt any shaking, and nothing else in the room had moved. I walked back to the bed and grabbed the mattress, pulling it up off the floor. It was heavy and awkward, and I struggled to maneuver it back onto the bed frame. My son got up to help me, and together we managed to get the mattress positioned correctly on the bed. I quickly pulled the sheet over the mattress and lay back down, my heart still pounding. My son got back into his bed as well. We looked at each other across the darkness of the room. "What's happening, Dad?" My son asked in a small voice. "I don't know," I admitted. "But we're going to be okay. We'll just try to get some sleep, and in the morning we'll leave." But sleep was the last thing that would happen that night. The mattress beneath me began to shake. At first it was subtle, just a slight vibration. But within seconds it had escalated into violent shaking, bucking and jolting beneath me like a wild animal trying to throw off a rider. I had to grab onto the edges of the mattress with both hands just to keep from being thrown off onto the floor. I looked over at my son and saw that his mattress was doing the same thing. He was holding on with white-knuckled hands, his eyes wide with terror. This continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The mattresses would shake violently, then stop. The chandelier would flicker on and off. The scratching would start up in the walls. The door would creak open and closed. It was like being caught in some kind of paranormal storm, with waves of activity crashing over us again and again. And through it all, we could hear the town hall clock striking the hours. The deep sonorous bong of the clock echoed through the night, marking the passage of time. 10 o'clock. 11 o'clock. Midnight. 1 in the morning. 2 in the morning. Each hour that passed felt like an eternity. We didn't sleep. We couldn't sleep. We just lay there in our shaking beds, holding on, waiting for morning to come. My son and I would call out to each other periodically, making sure the other was still okay, trying to comfort each other in the darkness. I have never been so frightened in my entire life. This was beyond anything I had ever experienced or could have imagined. This wasn't a scary movie or a campfire story. This was real, happening to us, in a locked apartment in a foreign country where we didn't speak the language and had no one to call for help. I tried to think rationally about what was happening. Could there be an explanation that didn't involve the supernatural? Could there be vibrations from traffic or construction causing the mattresses to shake? But the street outside was quiet. Could there be some kind of prank or trick? But we were locked in the apartment, and there was no way anyone else could be causing these things to happen. The only explanation that fit all the phenomena we were experiencing was one that I didn't want to accept. The apartment was haunted. Something was in there with us. Something that could move objects and create sounds, and generally terrorize anyone unfortunate enough to spend the night there. I thought about the landlady and how quickly she had been willing to rent us the apartment for such a low price. I thought about how the apartment had been available on short notice, even though it was summer and tourist season. I thought about the lockbox with the key outside, allowing renters to come and go without ever meeting the landlady in person. She knew. She had to know. She was renting out a haunted apartment to unsuspecting tourists who would pay for 3 nights up front and then flee after experiencing what we were experiencing. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. 3 o'clock. 4 o'clock. 5 o'clock. The phenomena continued throughout the night, sometimes intense, sometimes quieter, but never stopping completely. There was always something happening, some sound or movement that kept us tense and afraid. Finally, mercifully, the sky outside the window began to lighten. Dawn was coming. 6 o'clock struck, then 7. As the sunlight grew stronger, the paranormal activity seemed to decrease. The mattresses stopped shaking. The chandelier stayed off. The scratching and creaking stopped. By 8 o'clock, everything was quiet. The apartment felt normal again. or as normal as it could feel after the night we had just endured. My son and I lay in our beds, exhausted but too wired to sleep, waiting for enough time to pass that we could reasonably get up and leave. At noon, we finally found the strength to get out of bed and pack our belongings. We moved quickly and efficiently, throwing our clothes and toiletries into our bags without bothering to fold or organize anything. We just wanted to get out of that apartment as fast as possible. We didn't bother leaving a note for the landlady or trying to get a refund for the night we wouldn't be staying. We just wanted to leave and never come back. We grabbed our bags, rushed down the creaky stairs, and emerged into the bright sunshine of midday Varna. The city looked beautiful and normal. People going about their daily business. Tourists walking around with cameras. Children playing in the parks. It was hard to believe that just upstairs in that innocent-looking building, we had spent the most terrifying night of our lives. We found a different hotel, one in a modern building, with good reviews and reasonable prices. We checked in and immediately went to our room and slept for most of the afternoon, finally able to rest now that we were in a safe place. We stayed in Varna for 2 more days, as we had originally planned, but we never went back to that apartment. We never contacted the landlady. We just tried to enjoy the rest of our time in the city and put the experience behind us. But of course, you can never really put something like that behind you. It has been several years now since that night in Varna, but I still think about it often. I still remember every detail, every sound, every moment of terror. It's impossible to forget an experience like that. My son and I have talked about it many times since then. We've tried to make sense of what happened, tried to find rational explanations. But we always come back to the same conclusion. Something was in that apartment with us. Something that wanted us to know it was there. Something that took pleasure in frightening us. I've done some research on the building since then, trying to find out if it has a history of paranormal activity. But I couldn't find much information. The building is old, dating back to the early 20th century. Who knows what might have happened there over the decades? Maybe someone died there tragically. Maybe some terrible crime was committed within those walls. Or maybe the land itself is haunted, built on some ancient burial ground or site of historical significance. I'll never know the full story. And honestly, I'm not sure I want to know. Some things are better left unknown, better left uninvestigated. All I know is that we survived that night, and we got out safely. And I will never ever stay in another rental apartment without reading all the reviews very carefully first. The experience changed me in some fundamental ways. I'm more cautious now, more willing to trust my instincts when something feels wrong. I don't dismiss feelings of unease as quickly as I once did. And I'm much more open to the possibility that there are things in this world that science cannot yet explain. My son was affected by the experience too. For months afterward, he had nightmares about that night. He would wake up in a panic, convinced that his mattress was shaking, or that something was scratching at the walls of his room. It took a long time for him to feel safe sleeping in unfamiliar places again. But we both grew from the experience as well. It brought us closer together, having shared something so intense and frightening. We learned that we could count on each other in a crisis, that we could be brave for each other even when we were terrified ourselves. And we learned that sometimes survival is enough. You don't have to understand everything. You don't have to have all the answers. Sometimes you just have to make it through the night and live to see the morning. That apartment in Varna, Bulgaria, on the 3rd floor of that small house with the overgrown garden and the rickety gazebo, will forever be burned into my memory as the site of the most terrifying experience of my life. I hope that whoever rents it now has a better experience than we did. Or better yet, I hope that someone has finally done something to cleanse the place of whatever dark presence inhabits it. But somehow, I doubt it. I think that apartment will continue to torment visitors for years to come, as it probably has for years past. The landlady will continue to rent it out to unsuspecting tourists at bargain prices, knowing that most of them will flee after one night and never ask for their money back because they'll just want to forget the whole experience. And somewhere in Varna, that building still stands, looking innocent from the outside, hiding its dark secret from the world. The third-floor apartment waits for its next victims, ready to subject them to a night of terror that they will carry with them for the rest of their lives. I survived my night in that haunted apartment, but I will never forget it. And I will never stop wondering what exactly was sharing that space with us. What invisible force was moving our mattresses and scratching at the walls and turning the lights on and off. Some questions have no answers. Some experiences defy explanation. And sometimes all you can do is survive and tell the story, hoping that maybe, just maybe, your warning will save someone else from making the same mistake you made. If you ever find yourself looking at rental apartments in Varna, Bulgaria, and you see one on the third floor of a small house with a garden and a gazebo that's priced suspiciously low, do yourself a favor. Keep looking. Trust me on this. It's not worth it. Story No. 9. The moment my mother finally believed. There are some truths that people refuse to accept no matter how much evidence you present to them. They will dismiss your experiences, explain away your stories, and convince themselves that you are mistaken or confused, or simply making things up. And there is nothing you can do to change their minds. You can tell them what you have seen 1,000 times, and they will still look at you with skepticism or pity or concern. But sometimes, in the most unexpected moments, the truth becomes undeniable. Sometimes the person who doubted you most is forced to confront the reality they had always refused to believe. This is the story of how my mother, who spent my entire life dismissing my ability to see ghosts, finally understood that I had been telling her the truth all along. And tragically, she only came to believe me at her own funeral. I need to start at the beginning, with my childhood and the experiences that shaped who I became. I grew up in an old house on the outskirts of a small town. The house had been built in the early 1900s, and it had the kind of history that old houses accumulate over decades of different families living and dying within their walls. My parents had bought the house when I was just a baby, attracted by the low price and the large lot it sat on. They didn't care that the house was old and needed work. They saw potential where others saw problems. From my earliest memories, I was aware of presences in that house. Things that other people couldn't see or sense. I would see figures walking through rooms. Shadows that moved independently of any light source. Faces that would appear briefly and then vanish. As a very young child, I didn't understand that these things were unusual. I thought everyone could see what I saw. I thought it was normal for people who weren't quite solid to walk through walls, or appear and disappear without using doors. I remember being 3 or 4 years old, and telling my mother about the old woman I had seen in my bedroom. I described her in detail, her long gray hair pinned up in a bun, her old-fashioned dress that went down to her ankles, the sad expression on her wrinkled face. I told my mother that the old woman had stood at the foot of my bed watching me, and that when I said hello to her, she had smiled sadly and then faded away like smoke. My mother's reaction to this story was not what I had hoped for. She didn't validate my experience or ask me more questions about what I had seen. Instead, she told me very firmly that I had been dreaming. She said that old women don't just appear and disappear in people's bedrooms, and that I needed to understand the difference between dreams and reality. She said it in a kind voice, the voice you use when you're trying to gently correct a child who is confused about something, but there was no mistaking her message. What I had seen was not real. But I knew it was real. I knew the difference between sleeping and waking, between dreams and actual experiences. The old woman had been there, as real as my mother standing in front of me telling me she wasn't real. And over the following weeks and months, I saw her again several more times. She would appear in different parts of the house, always with that same sad expression. Always watching me with what seemed like concern or curiosity. I saw other things too. I saw a man in a military uniform, standing in our hallway, staring at a spot on the wall as if he was looking at something I couldn't see. I saw children playing in our backyard, running and laughing soundlessly, their forms slightly transparent in the sunlight. I saw a woman in our kitchen late at night, moving around as if she was preparing food, her hands going through the motions even though there was nothing actually in them. Each time I saw something, I would tell my mother about it, and each time she would dismiss what I had seen. Sometimes she would say I was dreaming or imagining things. Sometimes she would say I was making up stories for attention. Sometimes she would just change the subject, clearly uncomfortable with the topic and unwilling to engage with it. As I got older and started school, I learned to be more careful about who I told about my experiences. I had made the mistake of mentioning to some classmates that I could see ghosts, and they had mocked me mercilessly. I was called crazy and weird and a liar. Kids can be cruel, and they seized on this difference in me and used it as ammunition to exclude and ridicule me. It didn't take long for me to learn that most people didn't want to hear about the things I could see. But I still told my mother. She was the one person I thought should believe me, the one person who should trust that I was telling the truth. I wasn't a child who lied about other things. I wasn't prone to making up elaborate stories or seeking attention through deception. I was a quiet, thoughtful child who told the truth about everything else in my life. Why would I suddenly start lying about seeing ghosts? But my mother remained skeptical. As I entered my teenage years, her skepticism turned into something closer to concern. She started to worry that there might be something wrong with me mentally. She took me to see a counselor, who asked me questions about my home life and my feelings and whether I was hearing voices. I tried to explain that I wasn't hearing voices in my head. I was seeing actual figures of people who had died. But the counselor just nodded and wrote notes and gave my mother pamphlets about childhood anxiety and overactive imaginations. My mother never quite went so far as to take me to a psychiatrist or put me on medication. But I could tell she was considering it. She would watch me carefully, looking for other signs of mental illness or instability. She would ask me leading questions, trying to determine if I was struggling with reality in other ways. But I wasn't. Aside from being able to see ghosts, I was completely normal. I did well in school. I had friends. I participated in activities. I had normal teenage interests and concerns. The ability to see ghosts was just one aspect of who I was. No different from being able to play piano or being good at math. It was a sensitivity, an awareness of a layer of reality that most people couldn't perceive. But to my mother, it was a problem that needed to be solved. A delusion that I needed to grow out of. As I moved into adulthood, I stopped talking to my mother about the things I saw. There was no point. She wasn't going to believe me, and continuing to bring it up only made her worry and made our relationship more strained. So I kept my experiences to myself. I would see ghosts in various places, in old buildings or cemeteries or sometimes just walking down the street, and I would acknowledge them silently and then move on with my day. It became a private part of my life that I shared with no one. My relationship with my mother remained strong in other ways. We talked regularly, saw each other often, supported each other through the normal ups and downs of life. But there was always this one topic that was off limits. This one truth about me that she refused to accept. It created a small distance between us, a part of myself that I couldn't share with her because she had made it clear she didn't want to hear about it. Then, in 1998, my mother was diagnosed with cancer. It was pancreatic cancer, one of the most aggressive and difficult to treat types. The doctors told us that the prognosis was not good, that this type of cancer was usually caught too late for treatment to be effective. But my mother was a fighter. She immediately started chemotherapy, determined to beat the disease through sheer force of will. I watched my mother go through the brutal process of cancer treatment. The chemotherapy made her violently ill, caused her hair to fall out, left her weak and exhausted. But she kept going, kept fighting, kept believing that she would survive. I visited her as often as I could, bringing her meals she could actually stomach, sitting with her during her treatments, trying to keep her spirits up. My grandmother, my mother's mother, was devastated by the diagnosis. She and my mother had always been close, and the thought of losing her daughter was almost more than she could bear. My grandmother was elderly herself by this point, in her 80s and frail. She spent as much time with my mother as she could, but the stress of the situation was clearly taking a toll on her health as well. During this difficult time, I started to sense that my mother's condition was worse than the doctors were letting on. I would visit her in the hospital and see shadows gathering in the corners of her room. Figures that seemed to be waiting. I recognized these figures from past experiences. They were what I had come to think of as death attendants, presences that appeared when someone was close to passing from this life to whatever comes next. I wanted to tell my mother what I was seeing, to prepare her for what was coming. But what could I say? She had never believed me about ghosts before. Why would she believe me now? And even if she did believe me, would knowing that death was approaching help her, or just fill her final days with fear? So I said nothing. I just spent as much time with her as I could, holding her hand, talking to her about happy memories, trying to make her comfortable and loved. The chemotherapy wasn't working. The cancer continued to spread despite the aggressive treatment. In the summer of 1999, about a year after her initial diagnosis, my mother's doctors told us that there was nothing more they could do. The cancer had progressed too far. They recommended hospice care to keep her comfortable in her final days or weeks. My mother took the news with a grace and strength that amazed me. She had known, I think, that this was coming. She had felt her body failing despite the treatments. She made peace with her fate quickly, and turned her attention to making sure her affairs were in order, and saying goodbye to the people she loved. She spent her final 2 weeks at home, surrounded by family. My grandmother was there almost constantly, sitting by my mother's bedside, holding her hand, talking softly to her. I was there too, along with my siblings and other relatives. We took turns keeping vigil, making sure my mother was never alone. During those final days, I saw more death attendants gathering. They stood in the corners of the room, silent and patient, waiting for the moment when they would escort my mother to wherever souls go after death. I wondered if my mother could sense them. If on some level she was aware of these presences, even though she couldn't see them the way I could. My mother passed away on a quiet Tuesday morning in August. I was there when it happened along with my grandmother and one of my siblings. My mother had been unconscious for several hours, her breathing growing shallower and more labored. And then, in a moment that was both peaceful and heartbreaking, she simply stopped breathing. The struggle was over. She was gone. My grandmother broke down completely. She sobbed and held my mother's hand, calling her name, begging her to come back. It was terrible to witness this elderly woman's grief at losing her child. No parent should have to bury their child, regardless of how old that child is. The loss goes against the natural order of things and creates a wound that never fully heals. The next few days were a blur of funeral arrangements and notifications and all the practical matters that have to be handled when someone dies. We chose a casket, picked out flowers, wrote an obituary, contacted the cemetery. My mother had wanted to be buried rather than cremated, and she had already purchased plots for herself and my father years earlier in a cemetery not far from where we lived. The funeral was scheduled for Saturday, 4 days after my mother's death. It would be a traditional funeral with a viewing the night before, and then a graveside service the following morning. My mother had been raised Catholic, though she hadn't been particularly religious in her adult life, so we arranged for a priest to say some words at the graveside. The viewing on Friday night was difficult. Seeing my mother in the casket, made up with cosmetics and dressed in her favorite outfit, was surreal. She looked like herself, but also not like herself. A wax figure approximation of the vibrant woman she had been. I stood by the casket for a long time, looking down at her peaceful face, wishing I could talk to her one more time. Wishing I could tell her how much I loved her, and how much I would miss her. My grandmother was inconsolable at the viewing. She stood by the casket crying, touching my mother's folded hands, talking to her as if she could still hear. Other family members and friends came to pay their respects, offering condolences and sharing memories. It was both comforting and exhausting, all these expressions of sympathy and love. That night I had trouble sleeping. I kept thinking about my mother, about all the years of our relationship, about the things said and unsaid between us. I thought about how I had never been able to share my full self with her because she couldn't accept my ability to see ghosts. And I felt a deep sadness that we would never have the chance to resolve that disconnect. That she would go to her grave never really understanding or believing this fundamental part of who I was. The morning of the funeral was gray and overcast, appropriate weather for such a sad occasion. We gathered at the funeral home and followed the hearse to the cemetery. The graveside service would be brief, just some words from the priest and then the final goodbye as the casket was lowered into the ground. The cemetery was old and beautiful, with large trees providing shade and well-maintained grounds. My mother's plot was in a section near an old oak tree, next to the plot where my father would eventually be buried. The cemetery workers had already dug the grave, a rectangular hole in the earth that looked too deep and dark and final. We gathered around the grave as the pallbearers carried the casket from the hearse and positioned it on the lowering device above the open grave. There were probably 30 or 40 people there, family and close friends who had come to say their final goodbyes. My grandmother stood at the front, supported by 2 of my aunts. She looked small and frail and broken. The priest began to speak, offering the traditional words of comfort and prayers for the deceased. I tried to pay attention to what he was saying, but my mind kept wandering. I looked around at the gathered mourners, at their sad faces and bowed heads. I looked at the casket, that solid wooden box that contained what remained of my mother. And then I saw her. My mother was standing at the foot of her own casket. She was translucent, glowing slightly with a soft light that seemed to come from within her rather than being reflected from any external source. She was wearing the same outfit she had been buried in, but she looked healthy and whole, not ravaged by cancer the way she had looked in her final days. I felt my breath catch in my throat. I had seen many ghosts in my life, but never someone I knew personally, never someone I loved, and certainly never at their own funeral. My mother wasn't looking at me. She was looking at my grandmother with an expression of deep concern. She watched as my grandmother stood there crying, supported by my aunts, clearly devastated by grief. My mother's ghostly form radiated worry and love as she watched her mother suffer. I don't know what made me do what I did next. It was instinct, a desire to comfort both my mother and my grandmother in this terrible moment. I stepped forward and gently took my grandmother's hand. She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen from crying. I held her hand in both of mine, covering it completely. A gesture of love and support and solidarity in grief. My mother watched this gesture. I could see her expression soften slightly. Could see some of the worry ease as she observed me comforting her mother. And then, perhaps sensing that she was being watched, my mother's gaze shifted from my grandmother to me. Our eyes met. I was staring directly at her, this glowing, translucent version of my mother standing at the foot of her own casket. And she knew. In that moment, she knew that I could see her. She realized that I was looking at her, that I was aware of her presence, that everything I had told her throughout my life about seeing ghosts had been true. I saw the realization dawn on her face. Her eyes widened slightly. Her expression shifted from concern to wonder to understanding. For the first time in my entire life, my mother believed me about ghosts, because she had become one herself, and she could see that I was seeing her. We stared at each other for a long moment. There was so much I wanted to say to her. I wanted to tell her I loved her. I wanted to tell her that I forgave her for never believing me. I wanted to tell her that I understood why she had been skeptical, why accepting the existence of ghosts had been too difficult for her practical, rational mind. But I couldn't say any of these things. The priest was still speaking. The mourners were all around me. I couldn't start talking to someone they couldn't see without confirming all of my mother's worst fears about my mental health. So I just looked at her, trying to communicate everything I felt through my eyes alone. My mother's expression changed again. The wonder and understanding gave way to something that looked like regret. She mouthed words at me, and even though I couldn't hear her voice, I could read her lips clearly. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Tears started running down my face. I nodded at her, trying to let her know that it was okay, that I understood, that there was nothing to forgive. My grandmother felt me trembling and squeezed my hand, probably assuming I was just overcome with grief. Which I was, but not in the way she imagined. My mother looked at my grandmother one more time, that expression of concern returning to her face. Then she looked back at me and smiled. It was a genuine smile, warm and loving and at peace. And then she began to fade, her translucent form becoming even more transparent, dissolving like morning mist in sunlight. Within seconds, she was gone. I stood there still holding my grandmother's hand, tears streaming down my face, feeling a strange mixture of grief and relief and validation. My mother was gone, but before she left, she had finally believed me. She had finally understood that I had been telling her the truth all those years. That understanding, that validation, was a gift I hadn't expected and will treasure forever. The rest of the funeral service passed in a blur. The priest finished his prayers. The casket was lowered into the ground. People came forward to drop flowers or handfuls of dirt onto the casket as it descended. My grandmother had to be practically held up by my aunts. She was so overcome with grief. But I felt strangely calm, at peace in a way I hadn't been since my mother's diagnosis. After the service, as people were slowly making their way back to their cars, my grandmother pulled me aside. She looked up at me with her red tear-stained eyes and said, "Thank you for being there for me today. Your mother would have been so proud of how strong you are." I almost told her then. I almost explained that her daughter had been there at the funeral, that I had seen her, that she had watched over her mother with love and concern. But I held back. My grandmother was already dealing with so much grief. Adding the knowledge that her daughter's ghost had been present might be too much for her to handle. Instead, I just hugged my grandmother and told her that I loved her. And I made a silent promise to my mother that I would watch over her mother, my grandmother. and take care of her in the years she had left. It was the least I could do for the woman who had finally, in the last possible moment, given me the validation I had sought my entire life. In the weeks and months that followed, I thought often about that moment at the cemetery. I replayed it in my mind, examining every detail, every expression on my mother's face, every second of that extraordinary encounter. I wondered where my mother was now, whether she had moved on to some afterlife or whether she was still around, watching over us from some invisible plane of existence. I wondered too if her brief time as a ghost had changed her understanding of reality. Had she encountered other spirits in whatever realm she now inhabited? Had she met the ghosts that used to appear in our house when I was a child? Did she now understand that the veil between life and death was thinner than she had ever believed? That consciousness persists beyond the death of the physical body? These were questions I would never have answers to. But I took comfort in knowing that in her final moments of awareness in this world, my mother had finally understood the truth. She had finally believed me, and she had apologized for all the years of doubt and dismissal. That apology meant everything to me. It validated not just my ability to see ghosts, but also the pain I had felt at not being believed. It acknowledged that her skepticism had hurt me, even though she had never intended it to. It was a moment of recognition and understanding between mother and child, a closing of a wound that had been open for decades. My grandmother lived for another 5 years after my mother's death. I kept my promise and stayed close to her, visiting often, making sure she was cared for and not alone. She never fully recovered from the loss of her daughter. The grief stayed with her until her own death in 2004. But she found moments of peace and even joy in those final years, and I like to think that my presence and support contributed to that. When my grandmother died, I attended her funeral hoping to see her spirit, as I had seen my mother's. But she didn't appear to me. Not all spirits manifest in ways that I can perceive, and my grandmother apparently was not one who lingered. Or perhaps she did appear, but I simply wasn't looking at the right moment or in the right place. Either way, I said my goodbye to her at her graveside, and felt at peace knowing that she was reunited with her daughter, in whatever realm they now inhabited. My ability to see ghosts has continued throughout my life. I still see spirits occasionally, though perhaps less frequently than I did when I was younger. I've learned to be at peace with this ability, to accept it as simply part of who I am rather than something strange or problematic. I've also learned to be selective about who I share this information with. Most people, like my mother, are not ready to believe in things that challenge their understanding of reality. But sometimes I do tell the story of what happened at my mother's funeral. When I meet someone who shares similar abilities, or who is open to the possibility of life after death, I share this experience with them. And I watch as they nod in understanding, recognizing the profound gift that moment represented. My mother never believed me about ghosts while she was alive. But in death, she became the ultimate proof of everything I had tried to tell her. She appeared to me at her own funeral, watched over her grieving mother, and finally understood that I had been telling the truth all along. And in that moment of recognition and apology, a lifetime of doubt and skepticism was washed away. I miss my mother every day. I miss her laugh, her advice, her presence in my life. But I am grateful for that final encounter, that last gift she gave me before moving on to wherever souls go after death. She believed me. Finally, after all those years, she believed me. And that belief, that validation, that moment of true understanding between us, is something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Death is not the end. Love persists beyond the grave, and sometimes, in moments of grace, those who have passed on find ways to communicate with us, to let us know they understand, to offer the validation or apology, or comfort that they couldn't give while they were alive. My mother came back to tell me she was sorry, and I forgave her. And in that exchange, we found a peace and understanding that had eluded us throughout her entire life. It was the perfect ending to our complicated relationship, a moment of pure love and acceptance that transcended the boundary between life and death. For the first time in my life, my mother believed me about ghosts, and I am forever grateful that I got to witness that belief in her eyes, even if only for a few precious seconds at her graveside on that gray August morning in 1999.